Hello everyone, I'm Gonzalo Varela, and today I'm gonna be talking about decisions scoring Fight and Rage and thoughts on making music for video games and other media. I hope this can be interesting for composers, video game developers, producers of other media, and people who just like Fight and Rage. Let's start.
So first of all, for those who don't know me, I'm a composer, sound designer, audio programmer and guitarist. Now I'm mainly focused on music composition. I hold a Master of Fine Arts degree in music composition for the screen from Columbia College Chicago from the United States, and I also hold two bachelor's degrees from the Universidad de la República from Uruguay, one in music composition and another one in guitar. I do audio work for media like video games, films, and plays since 2012. I am currently a teacher at the Universidad de la República and also teach annual courses in music composition for films and music composition and audio implementation for video games independently. Besides, I have held teaching positions at two other universities, which are Columbia College Chicago and Universidad Católica del Uruguay. And I have done assistant kind of work for composers such as Joel Corlitz, Roque Baños, and Tom Howe. As the title of this video says, even though first I'm going to be talking about music composition for media in general, I'll later focus specifically on my work as the composer of Fight and Rage, and I'm gonna illustrate the ideas with various examples of music from the game, as well as some music that isn't included in the final version of the game. So what is Fight and Rage? Fight and Rage is a video game developed by Seba Games Dev, which is basically Sebastián García, for PC and published in 2017. It was later ported and published on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One by Bleedworks, translated and published in Asia by East Asia Soft, and published in physical editions by Limited Run Games. As far as we know, it was the first Uruguayan video game to be published for these consoles, and I think it's the only one even today. It is a 2D beat-em-up, mostly inspired by video games of the 80s and 90s, features three main selectable characters and multiple game modes, being the duration of a main mode playthrough about an hour. Also features multiple routes on the main mode with different stages and endings, and includes a total of 44 music compositions. The game was developed between 2014 and 2017, and it was updated between 2017 and 2021, and the music was developed between 2015 and 2017. The picture on the right is of an arcade of the game developed by Spanish association Arcade Vintage, by the way. If we're gonna talk about making music for Fight and Rage, we should also talk a bit about making music for media in general. And making music for media is very different than just making music. Usually when one thinks of making music, they kind of think of personal expression, but writing original music for media, the most important thing has to do with the communication of ideas and emotions, which are in great part determined by the director or developer. Scoring a game, we have to focus on finding the music of the game and the music of each part of the game, and not the music of the composer, if that makes sense. The music we do will always reflect part of our personality, our tastes, interests, and experiences, but I don't think that is in what we must focus when composing music for media, but in communicating what needs to be communicated. If I'm a good composer but a bad communicator, I'm fired, because even if the music is the most beautiful, if it is placed in the wrong place or in the wrong game, it just won't work. Some people could maybe think that this is in some way a less artistic kind of work than composing autonomous music, for example music for a solo album or concert music, but I definitely don't think the work is less artistic because of not being able to make anything we want. On the contrary, a lot of artistic ability is required to solve the problems that are continuously presented in this kind of work. We need to understand what is meant to be communicated, choose musical tools that can communicate it, and in addition the music we make must sound good, be interesting and enjoyable. Everything we do with the music is going to communicate something. It's going to give some emotion or meaning to what is being shown or played. Because of that, we have to be careful. We have to use the music to say what we want to say and avoid saying what we don't want to. We have to reflect on what the music needs to do in a particular scenario and think about if what we're composing actually serves that purpose or not. We could maybe compare the role of a composer for media with the role of an actor. That adds something personal to the character and the movie or whatever it might be, but at the same time it is needed for them to obey instructions given by the script and the director. The idea is not that we should not have an identity as composers, but that we must think at every time what do we need to communicate and find our way to do it, instead of simply following our habits. For example, a composer for media shouldn't decide to write all the music for a game for guitar simply because it's the instrument they play. That's not a valid reason. That would be like if an actor put a sad face in a scene just because the actor was sad. Another thing that is very important is to have fluid communication and mutual trust with the director of the project. The composer tends to be full of musical knowledge and resources, but that, together with the fact that they may be working dozens of hours on just a single minute of music, sometimes may make them lose objectivity about if the music is really serving the game, or if it's just music they wanted to write or came out somewhat spontaneously. Instead, the director of a game or film usually doesn't have much musical knowledge, but does have an intuitive, immediate, and clear reaction about if something is working or not, or at least if it's working for them. The director or producer will probably not say specific things that should be fixed about the music. They'll hardly ever speak on musical theory terms, and if they do, they may understand different things with those words than the composer. But we'll probably say simply, this music works or not, or I choose to work with you, or I choose to work with another person. And the composer must interpret those messages, decoding what musical issues they are related to. Also, for an experienced composer, there are many right choices that are going to be intuitive, but for a composer with less experience, it is probably convenient to be more conscious about their decisions, especially in cases where there is little margin for error, such as submitting a demo to get a particular job, where there are probably going to be many interested composers, and if one doesn't nail it on the first try, probably another composer will, and they justifiably be the one to get hired. Also, the more experience and musical knowledge one has, the easier it is to be flexible and capable of what I previously called finding the music of the game. If a composer can only do one thing really well, it doesn't mean they won't get to work, because it is possible that someone wants to hire them to do that precise thing on their game, because it fits perfectly. But most other times this won't be the case, so it is good to know quite a bit of everything to have more possibilities. So let's do a pre-compositional analysis of Fight and Rage. This is the kind of stuff a composer probably should think of before writing even one note. Let's observe a few things about the game and try to draw some conclusions. The first thing is that it doesn't intend for a realistic experience, and the player basically does only one thing, which kind of leads me to think that immersive and adaptive audio is not justified. In the meantime, the duration of the stages in the game cannot be predicted, which makes me think that the use of musical loops is justified. So let's talk a bit more about this. It makes sense to be enthusiastic about the interactive possibilities of music for video games, where it can be programmed that the music responds dynamically to what the player is doing at any given moment. Being able to work with music in a non-linear fashion is great, but it is something that in each case we should consider if it would improve the game in particular, if it's going to lead to positive results that couldn't be achieved through simpler means. Because complex implementation requires work potentially not only for the composer, but also for the programmers, and it is best if we can avoid making other people work unnecessarily. I believe non-linear music makes the most sense when the gameplay is also non-linear, which means that the player can do very different things in a specific moment. For example, if at any given moment they can transition from exploring the world on a horse to fighting, as could maybe happen in games like The Witcher 3 for example, or when it is intended that the player immerse themselves in the game as if it was a real experience, that is, that they forget they are simply playing a video game. However, in a side-scrolling beat-em-up such as Fight and Rage, the player will almost always be fighting, and there's also not the problem of realism being interrupted if the music does a fade out when ending a stage, because the game does not intend for a realistic experience. It is a game that has pixel art graphics, a point system, and energy bars, for example. I think interactive music may not only not be worth it in this case, but it could also conflict with the idea of evoking some kind of nostalgia of beat-em-ups from the past, which for the most part didn't have interactive music. Because of this and because stages can have variable lengths, I think it makes sense for most of the compositions to be implemented as loops. The only thing is that in Fight and Rage the loops are slightly more sophisticated than in many retro video games, because the compositions sometimes include parts that don't loop, and because Sebastian and I developed a way to avoid problems or limitations related to resonating sounds or effects, such as reverb and delay. Problems that usually result from working with a simpler looping system. The game also has little emphasis on the development of characters and story during a playthrough, which makes me think the use of thematic material or leitmotifs that identify characters and other elements of the world and the story, and which appear transformed throughout the game, is also not justified. In addition, this kind of material isn't ideal for loops. Thematic material may lose effectiveness and even bore if it is repeated many times. The game is also inspired by beat-em-ups of the 80s and 90s, but with updated graphics and mechanics, which leads me to think that the use of music that communicates the same emotions as the ones of those games is justified, but not necessarily through the same means. So maybe we shouldn't do chiptune music in this case. Also, the game has emphasis on action, which makes me think rhythm is the one thing that will mainly determine if a composition works or not, regardless of how enjoyable or interesting to listen to it is. Rhythm is extremely important for communicating and generating action, and the rhythm section was most times the first thing I recorded and tested in the game to see if a composition I was making was going to work. In films and video games with an emphasis on narrative, the music would probably have to mainly serve that, making it clear and avoiding to contradict it. However, in more retro and action video games, such as the ones Fight and Rage is mainly inspired by, the most important musical functions are probably contributing to the action. That is why the level of rhythmic intensity in the stages of Fight and Rage is almost never low, and adding another component of entertainment, of course. In the case of Fight and Rage though, we also wanted the music to communicate different emotions depending on the stage's aesthetic and the role they play in the game's structure. And there are also a few exceptional moments of narrative progression in which the music does have to support it. We will listen to examples of all this soon. So I wanted to show you the bass and drums of the composition Rising Force, which is the music of the elevator stage. And I think that implemented in the game, this music should work, contribute and never interfere with the satisfaction of playing the stage, even without the other instruments. Of course, the composition sounds a lot better and more interesting and fun with all the other instruments, but just putting this version into the game, it should work enough to sound promising. When working on a project, I think it is interesting to think about its musical identity, and if the music can have something that makes it particular and memorable. There are games whose musical identity may have to do with a complex kind of implementation or with a clear use of leitmotifs, but as we saw, this is not the case of Fight and Rage. So we know we need to support the action of fighting. We can add this to an influence of retro video games, which mostly feature instrumental music, music without singing, with clear rhythms of stable pulse and catchy melodies. We also have stages of very different aesthetics. We also need to compose a great amount of music that does not bore sounding all the same. And we also have a composer with experience as a guitarist and a liking for very different genres, which is me of course. So when we add all this, we kind of get the idea of starting from instrumental rock and metal with emphasis on electric guitar, but also including influences of other styles, such as funk, jazz, flamenco, electronic music, Latin dance music, experimental music, and classical music. But how can we generate unity and identity through the use of such dissimilar influences? Well, I decided that all the genres should be tinted with rock, especially in rhythmic and instrumentation aspects. This means that the bulería from Fight and Rage shouldn't sound exactly the same as a bulería from a flamenco tablao in Spain, for example. We also decided that some production criteria should be shared among the different compositions. Things like the settings for reverbs, delays, and mastering. In the case of Fight and Rage, the final sound of the music, the production, the timbres of each instrument, and the mastering was changing constantly while I was writing more music, and many times I went back to compositions I had made before to do fine adjustments to them, which means that I was regularly sending Sebastian updates he didn't ask for compositions he had already approved, simply because I thought there was some aspect of them I could improve, or I wanted their production to be more similar to a composition I was working on. And also, to help the player feel some identity in the music, it was important to rapidly show the player that the game's musical world is not limited to rock and metal. So let's develop this idea a little further, listening to music that may be heard in the first minutes of gameplay. I'm gonna be showing videos without sound design or voices so that we can focus on the music. The first song we hear in the game is Destiny, which is the main menu music. It features influences of rock and metal, which are the main genres of the music of the game. After going through the main menu and also choosing character, we hear the first music of the first stage, which is Nothing Left. This composition adds electronic influences and the use of synths. Proceeding through the first stage, we hear Go For It. This composition changes the style further, adding influences of funk, as well as the use of brass instruments and the less distorted electric guitar. For the second stage, we have two options. If we chose to go to the left on the first stage, we listen to Mirages. This composition is again very different, adding influences of flamenco, basically bulerías, and the use of nylon string acoustic guitars. If we went to the right, however, we'd listen to the composition Borders, which, like Mirages, has influences of Spanish music, but a different kind of Spanish music, as well as the use of harmonica, and also features nylon string acoustic guitars. What the player hears in the first music compositions may be important to give them an idea of where the boundaries of the music will be. I think we can draw a comparison with what happens in a 3-act narrative structure, where in the first act the rules of the game are usually introduced. I mean, what things belong to the world of the story and what things don't. And if near the end of a story we were presented with elements that hadn't even been hinted, it would feel kind of weird. In the same way, it is difficult to change the rules or main elements of a story in a different part than the first act without making it feel strange, it can also be difficult to change too much of the musical aesthetic of a game in a place far from the beginning without making it feel strange. It would have to be very justified. I mean to say, it would be more difficult for the use of very different musical genres to feel natural in the game if the first half of the game had exclusively metal music like that of Guilty Gear, and the second half had all the different genres and instruments. Let's look at other stages that had additional factors that determine changes in musical style. A very important factor in determining the sound of a stage was the aesthetic. For example, the composition Sunrise Rumba is featured in the Sunny Beach stage. It has influences of rumba and use of steel pans, instruments the sound of which is associated with the Caribbean, as well as other percussion instruments common in Latin America. The music makes me imagine a fun sunny day dancing happily at the beach. Another example is Immersion, which is the music for the Raft in the Night stage. It features a mixture of electronic and classical influences for a more contemplative composition, but which progressively increases in intensity, like the stage itself. Last, we will hear Ganisak, which is the second music of the cabaret stage that features dancers and lighting effects. This one has influences mostly of rock and roll. Another important factor in some cases was the stage function. For example, Breathe is the music for a stage with little mobility and low difficulty, but placed between a very intense elevator section and the stage with the last and most difficult fights of the game. It has a low level of energy, with darkness and tension to generate expectation and to contrast with the two adjacent stages. Now we will listen to Pumping It Up, which is the music for the training mode. For the training mode, since the player was supposed to be active, but they couldn't lose and they could spend as much time as they wanted on it, we went for a medium level of energy, but without tension or drama. Let's look at the intensity increase in boss fight music. We thought it made sense to have two different music compositions for boss fights, to account for some differences in the bosses and to add some variety, because otherwise on a playthrough you'd hear the same piece of music around 10 times. Having more than two would probably happen too much, because it would have been less clear in communicating when you were on an end of level boss fight. The exception is of course the music for the final boss, because we wanted it to feel special and thus it had to have a unique piece of music. First we have Shattered, which is the music for fast bosses. This is basically metal music like all the other boss fight music because we want them to feel very intense, but it is also faster than the average music in the game. Then we have Nightmare, which is the music for the big bosses. This one is also metal, but instead of being faster, it is kind of heavier than the average music in the game. For the last boss we have Vengeance, which is metal as well of course, but features not only a faster but also a more irregular and unpredictable rhythm than the average music in the game. These unpredictable rhythms make the listener feel a bit uncomfortable and alert, which is good for a fight as tense as the last one in the game. Let's look at some music that does the opposite, decreasing the intensity. In the case of Fight and Rage, there are a few story moments with no action, for which it was important to make a clear contrast. Their music is a lot less intense rhythmically, and in the first two examples there are no percussion instruments. But even then, some production criteria stay so that these compositions don't completely sound like audios ripped from a different game. The first example we'll listen to is the composition Shining. Now let's listen to Water Drop, which is for the next part of this very same cutscene. Going through a different path, we'll hear absolute zero. In the case of this composition, there is percussion, but even then there is a clear contrast with the action music of almost the whole game, because the tempo is much slower, because a big part of the composition features an ostinato, that is, a repetitive pattern that gives it stability, and because the instrumentation and texture have considerably less elements. Another example of a different kind of composition in the game is the music for the shop or extras section of the game. The shopping Fight and Rage isn't diegetic as the one of an RPG game. It's not part of the game that an in-game character can visit as part of the game world, but a section of the game the player has access to through an option on the main menu. Because of how intense the music of the main menu is, I decided the music for the shop should be less intense for some contrast, and also to help the player focus on what is being sold and on the descriptions and requirements to buy it. Maybe I should clarify when we're talking about the shop that the game features no microtransactions with real money. The only way to obtain currency is by playing. Now let's listen to the music for victory and defeat. Boss Defeated is the music for beating a level. It starts with a peak of energy on the last hit of the fight and follows with a loop for an indefinite amount of time that stabilizes the energy for the part in which the score is shown. A different kind of victory music is the song called Victory, which is the music for beating not a level but a game mode. This one's clearly happy, and ends instead of looping, which helps communicate that the playthrough has ended. On the other hand, we have Game Over, which is the music for being defeated and deciding not to continue. This one is clearly sadder and more dissonant, and also ends instead of looping, communicating that the playthrough has ended. Finally, let's talk a bit about the importance of composing just what is needed. Almost any demanding composition process includes music that is done but has to be discarded or revised. These are compositions that I presented to Sebastian, but which had to be modified. It may be worth pointing out that these audios may not sound as good as those in the game, because these were the first versions of the songs, with no revisions to their production. In these three cases, there was no problem in not nailing it, because I could modify these compositions and make them work, and even if I had to discard them entirely, as it happened with other compositions, it wouldn't have been too big of a problem either, because I had already composed enough music that had worked for Sebastian to trust that I knew what I was doing. The bigger issue may come in cases in which doing everything perfect on the first try can make a difference between earning the gig or not. So we'll listen to the first version of Mirages, a song we listened to before. This version is rhythmically closer to its flamenco inspiration, But because of that, it also has less rhythmic transparency and energy, which makes it less comfortable to play, and contrasts too much with the music of the other stages. Now we will listen to the first version of the song Different Trails, which is music for moments of decision. It is a composition mainly for a moment in which the player has to do an action that makes no sense to delay, because until they do it the game won't progress. The long duration and the changes between various sections in this version give a wrong impression of what is happening in the game. Having for this kind of situation music that develops throughout a minute is confusing for the player. It gives them the idea that things are happening while they are waiting, that the game is going somewhere, when the most appropriate thing was to communicate the opposite. As autonomous music, I probably find this longer version cooler than the one in the game, but Sebastian, who has very good musical intuition, suggested only using a fragment of this composition, and that ended up being better for that moment in the game. Last, we will listen to the first version of Pumping It Up, which was the music for the training mode. The harmonic progressions and rhythmic variation generate unjustified changes in emotion and intensity. You may have also noticed that in this first version there is also a rhythmic synth that is too loud, and the hi-hat also sounds a bit worse, which has to do with the production not being finished on these versions, as I mentioned before. That is going to be all for this video. This is my contact information, and I want to use these last words to thank Sebastian for working with me on Fight and Rage and for sharing many years of work and friendship, and everyone who watched this until the end. Finally, I would also like to clarify that even though in this presentation I didn't do any sort of very specific analysis of any composition in the game, such as a harmonic analysis, there are 3 digital transcription books published with all the music of Fight and Rage, the cover arts of which are on the screen right now. One features the guitar parts, another the bass parts, and another the drum parts. All are very precise, and the guitar and bass books include both staff notation and tablatures. These books are included in the physical edition of the soundtrack published by Limited Run Games, but are also sold on the website itch.io, and can be useful for those who want to analyze the music of the game closer or learn how to play it on their instrument. A link to find the books will be in the description of the video. That is all, thank you very much again, I hope you have a great day.